Hey, I'm Morgan here with Arna, and thanks for listening to this Future Skills Academy production. Today on Creative Leaders Unplugged, we talk with David Kester, a managing director at DK&A.
Yeah.
And what's the other title?
Yeah, he also is the managing director of
Oh, yeah.
the
Yeah.
Design Thinkers
Design Thinkers
Academy,
Academy
London.
London.
Yes.
And I'm having to memorize this because we actually didn't even talk about it in the podcast.
No, no,
So
we did not. No, we did not.
but
Which
that's
is
okay. That is quite okay because there were a lot of other beautiful things that we talked about.
so many. Yeah, and yeah. Again, I've known David for a long time. He's also been very inspirational. And he's such a great storyteller. And you can,
He really is.
yeah. So I don't know. What was your takeaway?
There were two. I mean, he started off with like explaining where he grew up, and that just instantly, was making me think of where I grew up. And it also, when someone explains where they're living to you, you try to put the pieces together and build a visual in your head. So I have a visual in my head, and so that's sticking very strongly with me. But then in the end, he also comes around and talks about organizational design and like the intention behind it.
Yeah.
And how sometimes organizations there's one organization that was very intentional with how they structured things and set things up. And I think that's kind of what stuck out with me. And then, of course, like how he brings it all back together, like you very astutely noticed. Sadly, podcast listeners can't see it, but his face really lit up when he talked about the other amazing people in his life.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, those are like the three main things, like having this really strong, he's a great storyteller. So you have this strong imagery in mind, and then like about organizations, and then about the importance of other people.
Yeah, I think that's my takeaway from all of this. It's also the power of storytelling. So being able to tell a story and you go like, why is he a good storyteller? What makes him a good storyteller? Because it's he has a great voice, he has a presence, but he knows how to structure the story, and it's sort of you can you visualize it. I see him as a kid, and I see him that where he grew up, and then sort of that's such a powerful thing because it takes you along with him on his journey, and so. And the other thing is people, like you said, amazing people. But he's always, he always knows somehow to connect to people that he then somehow, that help him or he helps them. But these are amazing people, and I know some of them, and they are amazing people, and some of them are quite well known, and they are amazing people. So people, community, people, ensemble, sort of the engine that is kind of, running, and it's purring, and it's like doing its thing, and it's when the team is working really well, and it's like, that kind of, So I think that's my takeaway because it made me think about how I create my kind of communities, right. So because when you hear you go like, that's really what you kind of have to kind of make happen. And then it's going to work, and otherwise it just doesn't. If people don't want to be together, if they don't like spending time together, if it's not this, what he said, it's a great dinner party, basically. It's great to be together and people enjoy each other, but there's diversity too.
Sure.
I think that's
So he mentioned at one point this quote from Winston Churchill, something along the lines of, if you design the surroundings will design the people.
You first start with the buildings, with the that's where you start. You start with that. So, which to me was a great metaphor also for organization. If you design an organization for people to feel powerless and and have no ownership and feel that they are in a safe space, then that's going to happen. You designed your organization because accordingly. That's why it's happening. So if you want to have an organization with a specific culture, specific behavior, specific output, then you have to think about how you have to think about the architecture. That's sort of
Exactly.
the architecture.
Exactly. And as I'm also looking at this, and he's had a an amazing career so far, and he does a lot of really cool things.
Mm.
And also he's been able to surround himself with incredible people. And that's kind of designing your surrounding in a way, right?
Yes.
Where
Yes,
he's
exactly.
intentional.
Yeah.
I moved to a new city, I didn't know people, so I got plugged in with this local group. He was
Yeah.
being intentional
Yeah.
kind of about how he's designing that surrounding. And I think
Exactly.
that's something a lot of people should be a bit more mindful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Design your own surrounding. Be with the people that
give you that
give
energy.
you that positive energy. And
Mhm,
yeah,
mhm.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, well, let's listen to the interview.
I might talk about being a parent. I might talk about being a Londoner. I might talk about my background. And so, yeah, we're all so many different things rolled into one. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of because I've never thought of you as a Londoner. I don't know why, because you clearly are. What is a Londoner?
What is a Londoner? I feel like actually quite passionately, partly at the moment. I'm even running a project for the Mayor of London.
Hmm.
But I see London as an amazing place where many cultures come together. I mean, it's a creative hub. It's a hub of many things, technology and so forth. But I think above all, one of the things that I particularly love about London, and it is actually something important to me, is that when you walk along a London street, you will hear so many languages being spoken. You will meet and see so many people from different parts of the world, and they all come together. And it enriches what it means to live in London. And I think it makes what we do, particularly working in the creative industries and working in design, so much better as well, because it means that we can design for so many different people, because as a city, we're made up of so many different people. But it's also one of the things that makes me feel comfortable, because in a curious way, I have an ambivalent relationship with the idea of being called English, but I never have a problem with being called a Londoner, which is where I was born.
Oh,
I
that's
live.
nice. Yeah. Yeah.
Have you always, I mean, of course you were born there. Have you always been a Londoner? Have you always lived in London?
Uh, Most of my life, but not all the time. And I've worked abroad, but I've also, as so many people do, I went to college, lived in Bristol, which is a lovely city. Lived in Oxford for some time. I met my wife Sophia when I was at Bristol, and then she comes from Oxford, so we settled in Oxford for a while, and I would sometimes move between London and Oxford. But also I've done projects and so forth and lived short periods abroad as well. But London is, I mean, it's an amazing place, and it keeps changing. It's changed so much in my life as well. So yeah, I always feel very comfortable here. But I love different parts of the world. I've so enjoyed many, many times coming over to Amsterdam and Holland. I mean, often to be with Arne and do things with him, but with others so as well.
Nice. And when you moved away, because I guess I didn't move until also university. You leave your kind of your hometown, the neighborhood that you grew up in. And I moved, and did moving away from London give you a different perspective on what it means to be a Londoner? Like, did it help?
Well, probably. I mean, I feel like actually the weird thing about London, or I think the special thing, is that if you move even around London, London is like lots and lots of different places. It's, we say London just like people will say New York or Paris or Amsterdam or Berlin or whatever. And of course, these places are actually, they're so big that they're made up of many, many microcosms. And I actually grew up in North London in a village called Highgate, which is actually on a hill. And I grew up I grew up in a block of flats, which was designed by a wonderful modernist architect called Bertold Lebetkin, who was sort of part of sort of Le Corbusier crew. Mm. And it was it's actually called High Point because it's the highest point in London. And we lived on the top floor of that block. So we were literally the highest point in London. It was an amazing experience, and I can talk about that forever. But the point that I was really trying to make is that living on that hill in Highgate is very different to, say, when Soph and I, my wife, moved to London after we'd lived for a bit in Oxford, and we lived with a really good friend of mine who's a filmmaker, and he had little sort of flatlet that we were able to rent underneath his flat. It was like a studio flat on the King's Road in Chelsea. It was amazing. And that was like a completely different experience, like totally different. And then we now live by the river in an area called Putney. And that's a completely different experience. And it's very green, and it's right, it's got the river, and it's got amazing green commons, Richmond Park and Wimbledon. And we have a dog, and one of the things I love to do every morning is get up and walk the dog. And so those things, but these are so many different dimensions of the same city, and they're completely different, and you slightly end up living in a bubble in that area, and then occasionally you go into the center, and it's like, oh wow, that's amazing. And I used to have this when I worked at the Design Council, which used to be based, and for the 10 years that I worked there, was based in Covent Garden. And so every morning I would get up and I'd either cycle or take the train, and if I took the train, I'd walk over Waterloo Bridge, it's not the most beautiful bridge, but it's actually called the Ladies' Bridge because it was built by women during the war. But it's also one of the most amazing visually, because when you walk over it, you are at this sort of particular angle to the rest of London, where you can, on the one hand, you see St. Paul's and that amazing skyline. On the other side, you look and you see Westminster and Big Ben, and it's just an amazing spot. And I would walk over that bridge, and I would feel like, oh, I'm like a little sort of molecule, or some sort of little vessel in the veins of this incredible city that's alive, and you'd feel part of it. So I just think it's made up of so many different places and spaces. You can find your space and place, and then you can also be part of this incredible thing where so many business and creativity and innovation is going on as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I, in a way, when I was listening to you, I actually thought, oh, but then it's so big and there's so many people, and how you might get really lost. But actually, you said no, that you can actually, there's so much going on, you can find your space. So it's actually the opposite of what I thought, actually, because I was like, oh, how can you not get completely overwhelmed and lost in such a huge place, especially as a young person trying to find your way? There's always a million other people do exactly like what you can do and better, right? But what you're saying, actually, no, because there's all these little pockets that kind of are just right for you. You will find your space. Is that how you experience it?
It is, and I feel that, firstly, I think communities and sort of urban design, which I've enjoyed the little bits of time that I've spent working around urban design, and I have done it for a little while. I led the Commission for Architecture in the Built Environment in the UK and got involved in some of the issues around that. And I do think that great cities work in that way. They enable sort of communities and to be communities in communities. And you've got these sort of almost like concentric circles and overlapping circles. And that's actually what makes them rich and exciting. And I certainly felt that actually growing up. It's something I was very lucky, where in that block of flats I mentioned, we had the most beautiful garden. It was like a sort of, it was like a sort of like a garden of Eden. It was very unusual because it was a social. So Bertolt Debetkin was an emigre, he's sort of Jewish architect and he designed the block flats in the 30s, and then another block went up in the 50s, also designed by him on the same site. And it was originally designed for a sort of printing company that made the sort of early versions of a photocopier called Gestetner. And the idea was that it was going to be a place where all their workers could live.
Oh.
And it would be like a sort of communal space for the workers, so like a sort of idealized place to live. And then when they completed it, they realized that it was all they'd spent far too much money on it, and they couldn't afford to do that. And so they then actually sold them off as a block of flats. So, so it never actually achieved that ambition of being a sort of slightly socialist sort of ideal of living, which I think would have been lovely. But it also meant that the people who lived in it actually had this, that we all managed, created this idea of a commune almost. And it had this beautiful big garden on lots of different levels, different lawns and sort of play areas. He's actually the architect who designed the penguin pool at London Zoo, same architect. And it had these lovely sort of interesting spaces, a little bit like that. And we were like the little penguins in there as children playing this space. But really, as like I would have my skateboard, and there were places that you could skateboard. And then I had, in fact, a few of us had go-karts, not with motors, just like ones like you handmade with the wheels of a pram, that sort of thing. But it was on a hill, so we'd whiz down and annoy all the other residents on our go-karts, and we'd make dens and climb trees and all that sort of stuff. So it was really special. And the school that I went to was, I would get up in the morning as a kid and I'd have breakfast. And sorry, that's because it's gone back a bit far. Okay, get to the point. But I would
no. Tell us.
I would set off through the garden, go down to, there was like a sort of this lovely brick wall, but it was easy to climb over. And I'd climb over the wall, and there was a pool house which an architect had actually converted into a home, and my friend Andrea lived there. So I would climb over the wall. Nearly always she'd be having breakfast with her family at that time. So I'd wave and she'd wave back. And then I'd get into the field and I'd walk across. There was like 2 fields, as there were playing fields to the school, through an orchard. And then I'd be at school. So it wasn't really like, this is what I meant, like London is not what you think it is always. And in fact, if I carried on beyond the school, I'd have been on Hampstead Heath. So it was like this like wonderful little island of green space.
So I'm curious about because the block of flats wasn't designed for people who wouldn't. I mean, it was designed for the people working in that company or that industry. Yeah. And then it wasn't. And then you sort of, so families moved in, people moved in, but and it still turned into a communal kind of experience. So is it the architecture, the design that kind of led to that? Because that's interesting. Like, or was it? Yeah, I mean, it must have been because it was designed in such a way that you kind of created that communal experience.
I mean, I think that's so true, and I think this relates very much to a sort of philosophy of design as well. So I think back to the Design Council, which was actually set up during the war years, in the middle of the Second World War, as part of an idea, a very visionary idea of the Churchill government to assuming that they won the war, how would we rebuild our industry? How would we rebuild our urban infrastructure? And they came up with this idea of creating the Design Council. And Churchill actually said, sorry, to your point, Arne, Churchill said, first we design our buildings, and then our buildings design us.
Yeah.
And I think it's incredibly true, that I think we can't underestimate the huge impact that the physical and built environment has on our behavior. It's why it's so incredibly important to simple things like having well-lit streets so that women feel that they can go out and exercise in the evening and that they don't feel that they need to be afraid.
Exactly.
In so many different ways, the physical and built environment around us it shapes who we are, our ability to thrive.
Yeah, it reminds me so much of, because I've been reading this book, Extended Mind. I like the subtitle as Thinking Outside Your Brain.
Yeah.
By Annie Paul, I think. So this idea that we kind of think of ourselves often sort of, our brain is in this dark room in our skull, disconnected from everything. And this is where all the thinking takes place. And she says, no, it's actually not true. It's actually your brain gets all this input from all your senses, and it basically just is a prediction machine. It tries to predict what to do and how to survive in an environment. So your environment is your thinking. That's what your thinking is. So if you are in a space, in a block of flats, like it's been designed as a communal kind of block of flats, and it will then do that. So just exactly what she's saying, this idea of it, but the people that you surround yourself with, are you in a dark space or in a light space? Are you traveling? Are you not traveling? That shapes how, your brain, that basically how your brain can predict things, because it has all these scenarios, but it's influenced by the outside world. What you touch, what you smell, what you see, what you, et cetera, et cetera. That's how you should, and in a way, so, it's not, I think most people are like, yeah, duh, of course, but we don't. But that's not how we organize things. That's not how we design our environments usually. So, that's a really cool, experience. And in a way, I'm thinking, did that have any impact on you that you still recognize? Because if you grow up that way, it must have some kind of impact on you as a person, or as a,
hugely. One thing I realized very early in life was, because I would, I'd go around to other people, you make friends at school, and then you go around to other people's houses and homes, and then I would suddenly realize, oh, actually, everybody else is living in a completely different way to us.
Yeah.
Which of course, when you're little, you are the center of your world, and everything is like you are, and then you gradually sort of place yourself on the map, and you realize, oh, okay, I actually am interacting with the rest of the world. And that's one of the lovely things about design is that design is all about trying to see things through other people's eyes, isn't it? That's the very essence of what we try to do. But to your point, I would go around to other people's homes, and I'd realize, oh, they've got lovely homes. They were, different homes and so forth, but they were really, really different, because London is mostly made up of Victorian housing. So if you go to most people's homes, they're built in red. A lot of homes are built in red brick, and they're from the Victorian era, and sort of living in this sort of funny machine for living created by a modernist architect is very, very different, and created a very different experience. But I definitely think that it influenced not just my outlook on life, but also a passion for design. I was influenced also by the fact that my mother was a designer. So I saw some of those influences firsthand, but I actually only found my way to design very circuitously. And I definitely think that those very formative experiences almost, they form part of your DNA, and they made me really realize how powerful it can be. Definitely.
That's so funny, because you, in a way, what you're saying is that so the way you grow up in a specific way, in a specific environment, that does something to you as a person. So which then leads to the way we design our urban environments, produces a certain kind of person as well, in a way. Obviously, not everyone's mother is a designer, and et cetera, but it does, you carry that with you, where you grew up. And it's logical, because if you grow up, there's that, if you grow up in the mountains, you're a different kind of person than when you grow up on the plains, so so your location, your space, your place where you grow up, that does something. When you're Dutch, you grow up, below sea level, it does something to your psyche, Morgan. And so no, but it does. And so being very conscious of how you, if you build urban environments, if you it's such a responsibility, really, if you think about it. But I don't think a lot of, governments, if you will, are so much aware that it has such a long-term effect on people, really. So, yeah, and I'm also curious. So I'll just go back a little bit too, because I still see you go to school and jump over that little brick wall. And how are your school days? Did you like school? Were you someone who
How would
like?
they describe you as a kid? Like, that's what I want to know.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I think probably it would depend on what age. So when I was that little kid that was climbing over that wall, I was, probably more like 9 or 10. And I think that people would have described me as very full of energy. And I used to giggle a lot in class and get told off for that because things would just set me off. And I remember having a very good close friend called George, who was Greek. And the two of us just always saw something funny and something that somebody had said. And then we would get the giggles. But I was also very keen on what I did and the work. I enjoyed it. And then I think it's probably different from the teenager later. And we all go through, I mean, I think most people go through an awkward phase, don't they, when they're a teenager?
I hope so. I
hope so. I certainly did. And I think that I had, I've painted a picture which could seem somewhat idyllic, but actually, I think I had both my parents, they worked. My mum as a designer, my dad had many different careers. I mean, I look very fondly at him. They both passed away a few years back, but my dad just did so many things in his life. And also he was a very good person. So there was a lot to look up to in both of them. But they were, I mean, I was born in the 60s, which means really I grew up as a child in the 70s. And my parents were sort of 60s parents with 50s values. I mean, what was interesting about them was that they both pursued careers and enjoyed that, but actually they were somewhat stuck with 1950s values. So my mother would really feel that she had to sacrifice something of her creativity and herself as a designer to be there to have the meal on the table. And my father was, I mean, I always remember when we sat around the dinner table, my sister and I remember funnily enough, there was a lot of conversation was about work, which I think probably is how I understand or somehow almost ingested the idea of business and entrepreneurialism, because they would talk about, my mother she was a designer, but she set up her own design company and then she sold her design company. And my dad ended up on the board of a big company, and he did loads of things in his life and was very entrepreneurial and also very creative. He was a singer and he was on television and did all sorts of different things. So they didn't really understand children, and so they would just talk about the things that were interesting to them, and we would just sit there. But of course, you absorb all that stuff as a child.
Yeah.
I don't know how we got to this point in the conversation, but I somewhat rambled on that.
Yeah, how would people describe you as a child?
Yeah.
How people describe me as a child was your point. And so I think that when I reached teenagedom, I sort of felt like I had to break free. That there was something somewhat oppressive about those sort of slightly what I would call 1950s values, and it were somewhat, I don't know, they were old-fashioned. And
what are 1950s values? What can you give me an example?
Well, yeah, I tell you, actually, it very much came to, there was a moment when all of it crystallized for me. A couple of things. One was my parents had a lot of books, and I think they were sneaky, actually, as well, with their books. And what they would do is they would put books on shelves so that my sister and I might find them and open them and read them. So we never realized that. So things like, they never talked to us about sex education, because that would have been like 50s parents didn't talk about this.
My parents
but they would
did
put
that.
books.
Yes.
They would put books so that you would go and find the book and read the book. So that's how they would manage. Yeah.
My parents did. It's so annoying. That's so annoying. I knew my parents did that too. And I was like, why is this book here on the table?
But I'll give you another example, because one day my sister discovered a book, and she opened it and she called me over and she said, I think you need to look at this book. We're in the book.
Ooh.
What? I was 5 years younger than her, so I didn't really understand what nurse she was talking about, because I think she was telling me this. She was about 12. I was about 7 or 8. So I was like really trying to understand what she was talking about. But the book was written by 2 psychologists, and they'd done a study of dual career parents. And our family and my parents were in this book. And these psychologists had come and they'd observed us. We hadn't realized. I mean, and I was just like a tiny baby at the time. My sister would have been probably, 6 or something. So she didn't remember either. But we were written up, and we were called the Harrises in this book. So we were anonymized, but actually it was very obvious.
Were there pictures of you or something?
No.
Okay.
But there were transcripts of what my parents said in interviews. And it was very interesting, because my father said, this is what I mean by 1950s sort of outlook. My father in the book says things like, it's wonderful to have a son now. And when he grows up, he will be a lawyer or an accountant. I know he'll do something, but also I believe strongly that women can have a career, and my daughter could be a secretary. So, I mean, of course, my sister read that, and I'm very proud to say that she's had a fantastic, fulfilling career. She did actually go to secretarial college to learn shorthand, but she did all sorts of wonderful things as a therapist and as a teacher, and all sorts of wonderful careers that she's had. So didn't hold her back. But I think those were values of a time. Yeah. So I don't look and think ill of them for those ideas, because they were the ideas era.
Yeah, but at that time, actually, I think it was probably quite modern. I mean, like my mother, when she got married, or actually when she announced that she was going to get married, so she worked as a nurse. Her boss kind of called her into the office and said, "So we're so sorry to see you go." And you're like, what? Because you're going to have children, and you can't be married and working. So she got fired basically because she got married. So in a way saying, hey, I think women can have a career in that context. It's actually quite modern in that sense. Now, so yeah, if you look back at things, there's a lot of things where you go, whoa, we did what? We said what? But it's so, in a way, yeah, it's kind of, you showed me a picture of your father once when he had this, it's like a Fred Astaire kind of outfit with his hat and it's, the cane and the suit. And it's such a, it's amazing. It's like very glamorous, very glamorous. So really, really interesting parents, very, very interesting people. And so something to look up to, but also maybe, in a way, it again is the very unique personalities as well, strong personalities in that sense, right?
Yeah, they were something to. I mean, there was also the fact that both. I think they both came from not troubled backgrounds, but they had struggle. in their life. And like many people, actually, of their era, because they were both born in the 1920s. So, they lived through the war years. But they had their own stories that were really quite powerful. My mother was a Kindertransport child, born in Germany and lived the whole Nazi experience. And my father grew up in the East End of London, 5 brothers in a very small 1-bedroom flat without sort of all of the mod cons. And both of them, my dad's parents, my grandparents on that side, were refugees from the pogroms of Russia and Poland. And so I think their context, I mean, they came through all of that. And then, of course, we were brought up as the next generation. And I mean, this is what happens, of course, often with refugees, that's like the next generation have it easy. So there was I growing up in this slightly idyllic modernist flat. And of course, as you grow up, you suddenly realize that actually it wasn't like that for your parents. They didn't grow up like that. It also creates quite an expectation, So I think that, it creates pressures as well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So I think I felt that, which was probably also wrapped into why, when you asked what was I like as a child, I think there was the sort of child that didn't know those things and was just living in this lovely bubble, enjoying the bubble. And then the child that gradually became more alert to the world that they live in, the world that everybody lives in, and also the world that my parents had inhabited, and the history and the context. And I think that then creates I think us all at that age, that sort of, I need to find out who I am in this. So yes, so I think my teenage years, like many of us, were that search for identity, I suppose, really.
Yeah.
And you talked about some of the things that crystallized that realization, and of course wanting to kind of escape that, maybe that bubble. Did you have like one big escape, or did you have many little things that you started to do? Search for your
the great escape.
Most of that's totally now off record, because there's too many people who might, not that I'm saying that so many people are going to listen to I mean, of course they will. It's your podcast.
What are you saying? Hello.
Exactly. But no, I did all the things that you can do when you're a teenager in London, and actually, I suppose what I would say is that my kids have been there too. They grow up, and I think that's what kids do. So it's good. And you want your young people in a safe way to try things out and experiment and so forth. But I think we all, people will rebel to a greater or lesser extent, or find their rebellion at different times. And it's healthy, because we all need to go through it. We need to find ourselves. So I don't think there was one eureka moment as such. I think it's a sort of a journey. I think, that continued into university. I think really the time that I probably grew up most was just when I left college. And I think the moment that I had the opportunity to work and be sort of useful in a way, it sounds very utilitarian, but that moment of doing things, I suddenly felt I came alive. It's like, this is what I'm here to, this is what I do, and I love it, and I never look back. And I think everything up until that point was some sort of preparation for making myself useful, and I loved the fact that you could work in some way as a sort of creative professional and be useful. follow the things.
What was the first job?
Well, when I started, actually, I suppose I could sort of slightly divide my career, if you can call it that, into chapters. And the first chapter is definitely sort of like an exploration chapter where you just go and try lots of things. But I started in the theatre. When I'd been at college in Bristol, I studied English and drama, and then I became very interested in design. And I started to design productions and work as a designer, and studied around and did my dissertation around design. And I suddenly realized, actually, this is the thing that was interesting. And after uni, I was part of a thing called the National Student Theatre Company. And we took a bunch of shows up to the Edinburgh Festival, and I was responsible for design. And so I had to make sure that 9 shows got designed and built, which actually mostly meant very quickly, with a few of us manically trying to build sets in a crazy way with no money.
Yeah.
But very quickly started to work in the Fringe Theatre. I became part of a little cooperative theatre, and then I set up my own little touring theatre company, and we got some grants from the Arts Council and set up some projects. And so very quickly, and we set up as a cooperative. So it was right from the beginning, I was sort of experimenting with also being a bit of an entrepreneur, sort of trying things out, whilst also learning from the other people that I was working with. So yeah, it started there with the theatre. And then while I was working in the theatre and living, actually at the time, I was living in Oxford. We actually, I can't believe it, but we actually lived in a garage. So that shows probably how much income we were both making at the time. I was with Sophia back then, because as I'd mentioned earlier, we'd met at uni, so we were living.
Yeah. Your second Greek friend.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a theme. Mediterranean theme coming through. But yeah, that was, I was working in the theatre, and I joined a local Friends of the Earth group. So it sounds very worthy, but it was a really cool group of people. And an email came through from the head office saying that there was
Friends of the Earth. Climate, is it a climate activism group? Is it just
Friends of the Earth is like, Friends of the Earth is like sort of Greenpeace. It's sort of got member groups. It's an environmental pressure group.
Okay.
And I thought it was a great organization, and partly just to also be a bit more engaged with life in Oxford, because I didn't know people. It was a way to be involved in the community. So I joined it, and this email came through to this local group. It's just it's a local membership group.
Yeah.
Saying that the head office is organizing a rainforest festival, and that they want other people around, and there's lots of local groups. Could people come up with some ideas and do some rainforest festivals up and down the country to raise money for Friends of the Earth? And I thought, what a cool thing to do. So I said, hey, why don't we do the Oxford Rainforest Festival? So we all set to, and very soon we had a big festival on our hands, with like a big comedy night, the theatre, Black Mine Theatre in a smaller theatre, all of the buses showing kids' artworks on rainforests, sponsored rainforest in the local park where people came dressed as rainforest trees, a concert for the rainforest, an exhibition for the it went on, and we raised a lot of money, and it was great fun. And the HQ and the phone for the Rainforest Festival was the garage where we were living. And it shows obviously that I wasn't working very hard at the time. I think I must have been a bit of an unemployed theatre person. But anyway, the upshot of it was that part of the way through this Rainforest Festival, we discovered that actually we were the Rainforest Festival, that email that had been put out by HQ, nobody else had taken it up. And in fact, HQ had some ideas, but they'd never got on with it. So we were the Rainforest Festival.
That's very
funny. And so then the founder, well, the director of the Environmental Pressure Group, this is a very long way around telling the story, sorry. But anyway, he came to the opening of the festival and we met him and everybody loved it. And then he said, hey, do you want a job? Why don't you come and work for Friends of the Earth? So that was my first proper job. That was a very long way of telling you. That was
it's awesome. That's a very good story because it first of all, it tells you something about you, but also it's kind of also about the time that which is taking place, because it's that time when there is no social media and there's no, so you can actually somehow be sort of disconnected. That nowadays that would be like impossible, because like it will, everybody will know, and so kind of in a way it's almost like you could really do things in like a pocket. And then must have been so great to be in that headquarters office, and that they started realizing that actually there's it's actually happening somewhere. And they're like, what?
This job for us.
I still somehow feel almost slightly guilty to this day, although my colleagues who were members of that local group, because we were all volunteers just doing this, we all did it. It was like, I'm a massive believer in the idea of an ensemble. And, in the end, that's how really great creativity happens. That's how great movies are made, how wonderful creative projects come into being, because people get together, they work together, they understand each other's strengths, they play to their own strengths, and actually that little project was just an example of that. And I wasn't responsible for it. We all worked on it together, and then actually they offered me a job. But actually, I remember this most wonderful woman called Erica Eisen, who was a member of that group, who, if it hadn't been for her, it also wouldn't have happened. But, actually, they didn't want to go and work running creative projects for Friends of the Earth in London. And when I was offered that opportunity, it was like, oh, that sounds really fun. And so, I leapt at it.
And this is when you moved back to London, right? So
that's right. Yeah.
How long did you work there?
About just over 3 years. Yeah. Okay. So it's like a sort of proper first job. Mm. And actually, I remember there was a moment. You were asking about where are those moments happen, and it was 3 years into the job, and I'd actually organised a festival at a very cool chapel called the Union Chapel in Islington. It was like a music event, and we had all sorts of things going on. And it was also happened to be then the night that my first child was born, Joe. And I remember it very vividly that evening. It was a very special evening. And of course, because I left everybody to be with Soph, and we had our first child. But also it was a moment where in that moment I realized, okay, I have to leave, because although I loved working for Friends of the Earth, I knew that we needed to earn more money. I had to find another way to support a family. So I was having great fun, and I was really enjoying working for an environmental pressure group. And I'm sure today, if they heard this, they'd say, hey, we pay our people really well, because the world has changed. But this was then. So that's when I struck out, and one thing came to another, sort of things just fell into place. And it was very weird. I ended up running an organization called D&AD, Design and Art Direction, which represents the design and advertising industries, particularly the creative side of that. industry in the UK. And it's like an academy, and it runs educational programs. It runs the big award scheme. It publishes. It's a really great institution. And it had run into real problems. And the guy who was trying to rescue it was an incredible man. He became a mentor to me. He sadly died a few years back. His name's Anthony Simmons Gooding, and he was really, I always said that he was a captain of industry, and he would say, no, I was a mere lieutenant, but that was just because he was very humble. And he wanted to turn around this, he was asked to help turn around this sort of institution in Britain that had actually got into trouble. And he decided he needed some young person who was foolish, who would throw themselves at it, to help him do that. So he sort of found me and pulled me into this sort of crazy space. And I then had the most amazing 10 years there. It was incredible. And if I'm honest, I'd studied design and I'd worked in design. I'd worked as a set designer. But I think the greatest education that I had was doing that job, because I would spend every day with amazing designers and talking about design, learning about design, writing about design and creativity generally. And being in that mix for 10 years was an immersion in what creativity is all about. And that was an inspiration. And the people who work in that industry, they lift you up. That's what happened. So it was a real privilege. I mean, it was extraordinary.
Well, how did he find you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you maybe undersold yourself that you're foolish. I mean, foolish, yes, maybe, I don't know, but foolish and like what about you made them choose you?
Well, I just happened to be running a project at the time, which was all about the relationship of design to industry and business. And I had set up some just interesting sort of conversations. So I have to say, it wasn't very profound, but they were interesting. So we would I would bring people who were, say, working in the airline industry and British Airways and so forth. And I'd get them to meet the people who are working at the Royal Opera House so that they could look at how the Royal Opera House can turn around the design of a production in a really short period of time. And so the idea was really learning from each other, from these different areas of creativity and design. And that was through that I met Anthony, and he said, I want somebody with that sort of spirit here. It was a chance meeting. And I was 28 and a very sort of naive and keen and eager to earn more to support my young family. And him saying, you could run this. Do it. And I was like, yeah, I could do that. And then of course, very quickly realized, oh my God, this is difficult. But actually, he was amazing because he was there, he supported me, and he was an amazing coach and mentor. I learned an enormous amount from him. He was there for that whole period of 10 years and beyond. Actually, he stayed a friend for life.
That's nice. So yeah, because I think it's really important, especially when you are kind of thrown into such an experience that you need a mentor. So it's actually really, and I don't think a lot of people have had that, that they didn't have the mentor they should have had. They were just, thrown into something like this. And, having that kind of person, so important, right?
I think it's actually, it is underestimated, but it's one of the most powerful things that you can have, and it's a great thing. And I mean, the whole idea of having a mentor, having an ally as well, somebody who supports you, it's something that we can do for others, and it's definitely something. I mean, I suppose if I look at the things that I'm proudest of, Often it's looking at the people that have come through and thrived and done something special because they happen to have worked in your team, and maybe because of some sort of support or help that you gave them. And it's not that you can pat yourself on the back, it's just that it's very satisfying.
Yeah.
And he very much did that for me. And he would actually say to me, I mean, I remember actually there was a funny moment. So we had a board, I was the chief executive, and we built, and the team grew over the years, and we thrived, and it was a really lovely journey. And a few years in, and every year we publish a book, and it was called the D&AD Annual. It's still published every year. I remember the 50th anniversary annual. It's been going many, many years now. And it's like a compendium of amazing creativity from that year. And every year we would give the privilege of designing the cover to a different great graphic or art director or whatever from the industry to design. And in this particular year, the president of the organization, who had the privilege, that was one of the things that he could do, or she could say, I'm going to ask this person to do it. Graham, who became a lovely man, Graham Fink, wonderful art director. He had this, he won't mind me saying this because he'll remember this story very vividly himself if he ever listened to this. He had this idea that the book is often called the Bible in the industry. So let's actually make it into a Bible, and we'll do it in the way that a Bible is, and it's got the embossed cross in it, and it's got gold and leather and the tassels and all of that. And that's how we'll do it this year. And one of my team, Alex AD, wonderful person, who was the awards director, was profoundly Christian. And she was really offended by this. And she said, I can't live with that. I can't live with that. And in fact, if we did this, I would leave, because I can't. It's too offensive to me that you take the idea of Christianity and a Bible and then you fill it with advertising and design. And it's two ideas that don't work together, and we shouldn't do it. And I think it's offensive, it's sacrilege. So I thought, well, actually, okay, I didn't feel so bad about it. I thought it was funny, but I felt, actually, if this is going to offend somebody, and if it's offending one of my team, we can't do it. So we had this board meeting, and I said, Graham, we can't do this. He said, of course we can. And I said, no, you can't. In fact, we're not going to do it. And it became a bit of an argument. And then I said in the meeting, Graham, if you decide to do it, and it is your prerogative, then I will resign. And he looked at me and said, well, I'm not going to, he laughed, and he said, well, we're definitely not going to do that. And let's forget the book as the Bible, because, David, we don't want you to resign. So that was sort of the end of that. And we all moved on. And after the meeting, Anthony came over to me and he said, let's just sit down and have a chat about what just happened in there. And it's like, well, I thought that went very well. He said, I think that went very badly. He said, never, ever, ever threaten to resign unless you really mean it. And in fact, really, if you're quite happy to leave. And that's what having a mentor is also about. And talk about it, and let's work out a plan, because there were other ways to resolve that rather than putting yourself on the line in such a way. So, which is, of course, what we do when we're young as well, because we live in the moment and we're and so forth. And gradually we hopefully become a little wiser, and we don't act impetuously like that. But
having a mentor at so many other, yes, of course. I mean, this is a situation where someone needed to show you or tell to have a tough conversation with you, for sure. But I think if you know this, that if the clients we work with, the companies we work with, the people in the often I think everyone can use a mentor or a companion, someone who has a honest conversation, because in my experience, it's really missing, and people are they're either too polite, or they're too careful, or they don't feel safe, but it really helps when someone every now and then says, listen, that's not good, should do that. And we have another.
The person that can do that best, I think, is somebody who isn't actually sort of in charge of your day-to-day tasks.
Yeah.
So it went in so many of people's jobs, they report into somebody, and that person who they report into, that person's most worried about whether they're going to get the job done. And what's really helpful is if you can work with somebody who isn't just chasing you on your tasks, but actually sees the bigger picture. I've had that. I've been very lucky to have that, because I also actually had that. So I have to confess something, because this is something that Soph says of me. She says I think she says it in a sort of nice way, but she says that I drag people into my orbit. That, like, if I want something to happen, then I will, I'll take the project on, and then actually I sort of go, hey, can you help me? Can you help me? And people come in and they support me to do the project, which is crazy, really, isn't it? But I've been very lucky that because I had a very similar experiences when I left D&AD, and I was invited by the then rector of the Royal College of Art, who happened to be the chairman of the Design Council, and he said, I think you should apply for this role, and then I got the job. And his amazing man called Sir Christopher Frayling. And then I ended up working for a succession of remarkable chairmen, and I found that I learned so much from each of them. I think it was partly that they were not concerned. They trusted me to get on and do the job. So they were supporting me to be able to do the job. And that's what Anthony did. He would say to me, look, I'm here to argue for you, to support you, to give you advice if you ask for it. And I think that it's a hugely it is underrated, Arne. I think if we can help people with mentorship, and often also what they sometimes call, it's a bit of maybe it's a slightly woke word, I don't know, but allyship, which is this sort of idea that sometimes people need allies because they may be in some sense, because of whether it's their ethnicity or background or something, they may feel that they're an outsider. And having an ally who supports them and looks out for them can be massively powerful. And it's often gives them the confidence. And it's the difference between, I suppose, feeling like you've got to fight all of those battles yourself and knowing that there's somebody who's battling for you. And it makes a big difference to confidence.
I somehow see a parallel between growing up in that communal space, the way it's designed really drives behavior. And in a sense, organizations, the way they're designed drives behaviors. So we don't design our organizations to create that kind of behavior or have those positions, because it's just not part of the design of the organization. That's not how it's structured. So people don't have that mentor. They don't have that ally. It's not even a word they would use, right? So in a way, it's part of what we do, obviously, thinking about these things and trying to kind of find other ways to design how we work. And it's part of that. So in a way, the building, that was kind of this interesting metaphor in a way. It's kind of very inspirational. You go like, yeah, but it's not just you have to build the building also first, and then well, that will also drive behavior. You can tell people to behave differently, but if the building isn't there, if they're not, if you want people to be, create some kind of communal experience, but it's not designed that way, it's not going to work. So how do we deal with that? Because I think a lot of people don't feel that they're in that safe space, or they don't have someone.
I think that's actually in many ways why I sort of found my way to the design work that I do now, which often is very strategic, and it is around more what the proposition is, what the service is, and how you create that through culture, brand, structure, because I find that very interesting. And I suppose the ideas and the people that I look to, that inspire me on that, they are the people who I think have really bringing some of the sort of best ideas of design into that organizational space. I'll give you an example. A designer that I think, maybe there are going to be some creative folk, some designers listening to this podcast. Many of them will know the designer Dieter Rams, one of the absolute greats of the sort of 1950s and 60s, still very much alive and kicking as an amazing industrial designer, and has set out some ideals on design, his 10 sort of values of design, which I think are brilliant. But he also created an extraordinary shelving system called Vitsu, which today is still one of the best-selling and most brilliant pieces of engineering design as a shelving system. And one of the things that really fascinated me was that idea, that little company, Vitsu, it's one of the only things that Dieter Rams ever designed independently of, his wider industry career. And it was bought by an entrepreneur and a great design lover called Mark Adams. And Mark built a business based on the principles of Dieter Rams. So he built these ideas of what great design is into the culture of the business, into the HR processes of the business, even into the manufacturing plant, which is a really amazing net zero sustainable building, into everything, the way that you can buy the product and the way that it arrives with you and the way that you're supported. It's in every fiber of the business are the values of Dieter Rams. And I find that really interesting. And I also see that in other companies like the amazing company Freitag, who make those lovely bags. I once gave you one, Arne.
Yeah, my favorite one. Yes.
Companies that have explored new ways of working, like holacracy, and often sort of adopted within the tech world. But I think it's really interesting because I think that we have to adapt our organizations and organize them in ways that are creative. And those are design challenges.
Well, they are designed for the behavior that you want to see. They're designed with a purpose. So you then through the results is culture. The result is how people behave. Result is the quality of the products or the services that you deliver. So I mean, I can imagine that you can design a bank, for instance, in a way that is very like a bank, but which might not be something I would like to work in. But the point is more that I don't think we design organizations in that kind of very explicit, conscious way to kind of fit with what we actually try to achieve. I think a lot of, and I know things are, and especially large organizations that are somewhat older, and they kind of just, they kind of, they grew and they bought other companies, and they kind of, it's really a mess usually, to be quite honest. I find it quite often that if I'm working for a large organization, I'm amazed that they actually make money, first of all. And how is it possible? Well, because everyone else is doing it the same way. It's such a mess. And people are, in general, people are unhappy. So, there's so many amazing examples out there. But but the sad part is that there are way more examples out there that are not great. And so, which is an opportunity, obviously.
I was going to say, it's almost like the organization becomes a byproduct of what they're trying to accomplish rather than being intentional about building it how this guy with the shelving really approached it, And I think can give a framework. I was just going to say, I have a friend who works at one of the biggest companies in the world, and I won't name names, but they are not doing good. And nobody knows. It's all very hush hush. But then when she started pulling back the curtains for me, I was like, oh my God, this is a mess.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
like,
but exactly.
Anyone like this,
Yeah, and so David, and me too. I mean, we kind of have some peeks behind the curtains in the kitchen of the company, which is the part. Which is the best part of the job. You go because you can also leave again. By the way, you're like, oh, so good luck with that. No, but looking into the kitchen and going like, oh my God, why do you work here? How is it possible? Why nobody feels safe? Everybody's just surviving.
And if you also take it back to the building that you grew up in, David, right? It wasn't built like, oh, we just need another building. No, it was built like, okay, we want to bring this group of people together. And okay, well, they can live together, and then we design it in this intentional way. It's really, but also super interesting. Who was the guy that applied the 10 principles to the organization?
His name's Mark Adams. Yeah, he's still running and taking it to greater heights, and everything he does is really infused with those values. Yeah, I mean, I've to your point, I've seen. We have taken that peek behind the curtain many times, and Arne and I have seen those close up. And I won't again name names, but we worked on with some big corporates, big global companies. Sometimes they've asked us to look at the relationship, for instance, between their frontline staff and their ability to deliver great services. But what they're really looking for is a sticking plaster. They want us to come up with something that's a quick fix, because they're looking at their next quarter results. And we've sometimes looked behind the scenes, and I can think of Arne will know of the company of which I speak. When we did some ethnography, and we went and we spoke with some of the teams around the world. And because we were trying to think about how you can unlock the potential of the amazing people that they have at their front line. And then we discovered that in some countries, they weren't actually paying their people. So that sounds like, no, of course they were paying their people. No, actually, sometimes a whole month would go and the person wouldn't get paid. And so that's a problem, isn't it? When we reported some of the things back, they didn't really want to hear that. I think that, you get some businesses that take the sticking plaster view, but also, Arne, it reminded me also of, are we allowed a name drop? Are we allowed to do that?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Tricky one, because
I'll ask, can we do this? Yeah, they say yes.
They say yes, okay. So over the years, on one or two occasions, I've had the real privilege to interview Johnny Ive. And it was really mostly to do with the fact that I was in, those jobs. So like running the design council, that sort of thing. So it's something that happens.
He didn't ask for you by name? He didn't ask for you by name? He said, let me talk to that guy who somehow.
He knew me, so it was like he was comfortable with me being interviewed. So I had these one or two opportunities to interview him, and we'd always prepare, and he would tell me some things that I found really interesting. And one of them is actually this bit about the relationship of the designer to the organization. And it's interesting now because he works actually independently of Apple as a consultant. But one of the things that he said was that he's always been quite he's had a bit of an antipathy, a bit of a sort of concern about working as a large producer of products and services with external consultants. And the reason that he would talk about this was that he felt that it's really important to have a responsibility for everything that goes with what you design. So it's very easy to come in from outside and sort of come up with your ideas and then walk away, and you leave someone with the problem. Whilst he would talk about the fact that if he were designing an iPhone or, the iMac or whatever it was, if a little bit of the sort of aluminium that he'd designed separated from the particular bit of plastic rim that he'd put into the screen after 6 months or whatever it was, people would always come back to him because he was the designer. So he was responsible and he had to be accountable for what he was doing. And I do think that that's actually a very interesting aspect of design, as it's the longevity. And I don't just mean that in terms of products. I mean, in terms of services and brands and how we design things, is thinking long-termist and being responsible for what you do. And I suppose it's one of the reasons why in the work that I do today, I particularly like building long-term relationships and working closely with the organizations and seeing things through and finding smart ways to get things off the ground. I'm a huge believer, and there's, I love a design thinking approach to that as well. So we've got a little plug here, but we have a book coming out, or I've contributed to a book that's coming out with some friends this Christmas, and it's on experimentation. But it's actually very much how I do believe good businesses operate, which is you don't go big, you start small, and you try things out, and you take a scientific approach to that. So it's not like, you think, okay, well, what are the things that we should test here? There are some things we know, so we don't need to test them, but there's some things we don't know, but we have a hypothesis on. So let's actually work out how we can run an experiment that will really test these things out well. And I do think that that's actually about responsibility. It's not about then the ego of the designer. It's not the ego of the chief executive or the business. It's actually really taking a responsible view as to how to develop your propositions and your products and your services, developing your ideas based around the needs of users, and then actually putting your own creativity into that space, making that leap of imagination, which is the exciting bit, of course. And then really bothering to run that experiment, test these things out well, prototype them, reiterate them, and start small and build from there. And when things are having the wrong effect, feel it's okay to stop and move away and change course. So, and I just don't think that happens enough. Usually people can't be bothered, frankly.
Well, they can't be bothered, and also they don't have time. Often they are, the workloads and the speed of things going to, the go-to-market kind of process of a lot of companies is like, and when do you do these things? When that's often a question I will get when I train people, for instance, in a design thinking kind of a process where we go into, you do your research, you built your your personas, and and then and you kind of you change the brief. You kind of they'll go like, we're thinking like 2 years ahead, and the things we're designing, creating, they're all already in the factory. And so what if that's wrong? Like, so I do also feel that there's a moment where we could, at least for me, I started thinking, well, how can I really help them? Because in a way, what you said something a few minutes ago, or actually an hour ago, I guess, you said something about how what you're most proud of is, really helping people where you go like, that you really helped someone, a person, be it in a training or some coaching or advice, or, really helped them, which I really resonates with me as well. But because I think, I think that is where we can make the biggest change. I think that's where it's because in a way, the changing the big machine is so difficult. But I was thinking, nowadays when I run these training, I really infuse them with such a tiny little attitudes, tools, little things that can apply straight away, implement straight away. It doesn't have to be design thinking. It doesn't really matter, but it's going to help you in the things you're doing. So you keep running, keep doing your sprints and be agile or not, or whatever you are, being completely lost and confused in whatever the company you're in. But hey, here's this little tool, and it changes the way you have meetings. Hey, here's this little tool, and it changes the way you can kind of visualize, your stakeholders, or, the way you, etc. Little things, instead of saying, here's, and I'm sorry, because I know the double diamond is your baby, almost, I guess. And so I love the double diamond. By the way, I love the double diamond. I don't like the triple diamond. I mean, I don't know how many diamonds people are start putting on this thing. Double is simple, it's great. I like it because it helps me explain where people are, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't want them to think that they have to go through these steps. I want them to go like, oh, this is a nice tool. You're like, oh, that's really helpful. Oh, well, if I have a meeting and I behave slightly different, and I put I design some pauses in the meetings that nobody's talking and you're just listening, or whatever, that was really helpful. And I feel that has been so, for me at least, so helpful to really help people, where they go like, oh, that really changed everything, thank you, instead of saying, yeah, so where do I go, where the first step, the second step, because it's too much, we can't do it, we're running, and we have 30 minutes meeting back to back all day. So that's, in that environment, how do we change things? And I think by changing one person at a time, right, by giving them one little tool at a time, that's sort of that's where I am, at least.
Seems like a good, maybe that's a conclusion. I don't know. I mean,
I don't know if that's a conclusion, but so my question would be to you, David. So we've known each other for such a long time, and listening to you talk, I love your stories, and you're such a great storyteller, and I know we can talk forever, and I know there's so many more stories, and I always love hearing them because they're inspirational. And one of the things that also now, and I think maybe Morgan, you can kind of agree with me or not, is that your path, your career, your kind of the things that you've done, when you light up, it's usually about people. It's usually, every time there's amazing people, it's like amazing people everywhere, but helping you. And maybe that's what Sophia said, where you pull people into your orbit, but it's also something that you recognize and you treasure, and you also lift these people up, right?
That's what you said in the beginning, the ensemble you started with. The ensemble is very important to me. Yeah.
So I think, if I take away anything from this, it's like I hear amazing people all the time. And so a lesson for me would be, look around the people that are around you, and because they're there, and you don't have to go look for it. I don't think you have to look for amazing people. I think there are amazing people, but recognize them and learn from them. And so because it's not just about them teaching you, it's also about you learning from them, and the willingness to learn from them, and kind of listen to them, and also kind of say, acknowledge that these are amazing people, instead of saying, no, I need to be, I'm the person that it's all about. And I know you need to be mentored. I mean, having a mentor is great, but you need to kind of be open to it, right? So like
let me finish on this little story. So I had the privilege, when I was running D&AD, we organized a lecture series, and it was a wonderful opportunity to invite amazing people to talk and just tell us about the incredible things that they do. And one of those people was the American graphic designer Milton Glaser, who, he's the amazing designer who created I Heart New York. Actually, yes, it was designed, and so much beside. such a profound man. And I remember we went out for dinner. But he recounted, and you can read it in his essays as well. He's written about this. That he recounted how he was asked, and he thought about what makes a really good designer, and what's the real at the heart secret sauce. And he said it's about working with people, the right people. And he said there is a test. So what you want to do is, whether it's a colleague that you're going to work with in the studio, whether it's a client, he said, what you want to do, you need to recognize that some people will nourish you, which means that when you spend time with them, you will feel good. And some people will be toxic to you. And when you spend time with them, you will feel enervated, and it will bring you down. And we have to almost view that as an experiment. Like, let's go and spend a bit of time with someone. Like Arne and I have spent many evenings together. And whenever we spend time together, I feel better. I feel I've enjoyed myself.
Me too.
And that's incredibly important. And we have to do that also with the people that we work with. I mean, one of the people I'm spending a bit of time actually on Friday with an ex-client, but he was a client he's moved to a different company, but he was working for a big rail company. He's ex-Virgin Atlantic. And we ran a project together. I just felt inspired every single time that he was in the room. And I loved the way that he treated his team. I loved the way that he was respectful of us and supported us. And because his attitude to us was so good, we were able to do great work, which also ended up in this book. I'm sorry, it's not the plug with the book, but
what's the name of the book? That's the name of the book.
Experimentation Field Book, it's called.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
And he was just so inspiring to be with. And I feel that he was, similarly, I feel that with some of I look back on, we've been talking about careers and so forth, and I can look back on the time that I ran DK&A, and there was a moment when it was like a little machine that was humming, and it was humming because the people in the organization loved working together. We were all having fun. We were enjoying each other's company. And I feel the same with the team, with the studio, when it's brilliant and when we are at our best, it's when we're all enjoying each other's company and supporting each other, and it's fun. And that's because you really appreciate each other for, that is back to the ensemble piece.
Yeah.
And, that whole thing of none of us is, smarter than all of us. So you just have to play to those strengths. And if you can make that work and enjoy each other's, the time that you spend together, it's so much better. And that's really what Milton Glaser was talking about. And it's how he lived his life, Pushpin Studios.
Awesome. It's cool. I think in a way it's round circle from where we started and where we ended. For me, the pattern of the communal and the ensemble and people and kind of bringing people together and enjoying it, because I can tell, right? You light up when you talk about people being together and working together and enjoying each other's company. And
it's been an analogy to me of innovate. When I was at the Design Council, we ran some really very exciting projects. Arne, you've heard me talk about them, designing out infection, projects on infection control with Design Out Bugs, it was called, in hospitals, or working on dementia care, or all sorts of really interesting projects, working with ministers and governmental departments. And it was the thing that absolutely I really loved doing, was applying design and design thinking and the tools and also the skills of real designers in those situations. It was incredibly exciting. But when we started a project, we would always get some of the core team that was working on this at all levels, from the most junior people working on it to the most senior, and we'd all have dinner together. And for me, it was almost an analogy of what innovation is about. That this whole idea of you bring people together, and it's like the best dinner party innovation, where people appreciate each other's strengths. They're not there. You've got diversity in the room. And if everybody walks out nourished, the likelihood is you'll end up doing some really good things together.
We're gonna end on that, because I think that's a great advice, and I think something to kind of think about. How are we creating that in our lives, in our business, and so it's really interesting. Yeah. So also, I started to think, like, how am I actually doing this now? So, so thank you for that, David. And I know we can talk forever. And we did, and we will again, hopefully.
We did, and I'm wondering how you're going to edit this down to manageable.
No
anyway,
worries.
That's your challenge, not mine.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. No, it's going to be cool. So thank you so much for being on this podcast.
No, it's been lovely, Anna, and lovely to meet you, Morgan.
Yeah, thank you.